Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known to history as Sisi, was one of the most famous women of 19th century Europe. She was admired for her beauty, idealized by the public, and transformed into a romantic symbol after her death. But behind the image, behind the portraits, behind the legends, was a real person whose life was defined not by fairy tales, but by political pressure, psychological isolation, rigid court control, and long-term emotional suffering. Elisabeth Amalie Eugénie was born on December 24, 1837, in Munich, in the Kingdom of Bavaria. She was the third of 7 children of Duke Maximilian Joseph of Bavaria and Princess Ludovica. Although her family belonged to high nobility, her upbringing was unusually informal for a royal household. The children were raised with relative freedom, spent time outdoors, rode horses, walked in nature, and were not subjected to the rigid court discipline typical of dynastic education. Elisabeth developed a strong attachment to physical activity, animals, and independence from an early age. And this is only the beginning. If you enjoy thoughtful history, stay with this channel and subscribe. She was not trained for politics, diplomacy, or imperial life. She was not educated as a future empress. In 1853, her life changed abruptly. Her older sister Helene was invited, along with Elisabeth and their mother, to Bad Ischl, where Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria was expected to choose a bride. The intended match was Helene, arranged by Franz Joseph's mother, Archduchess Sophie. However, when Franz Joseph met the sisters, he chose Elisabeth instead. 2 days later, he announced his intention to marry her. Elisabeth was only 15 years old. The marriage took place in April 1854. With no preparation for court life, no political training, and no understanding of Habsburg protocol, Elisabeth entered one of the most rigid imperial systems in Europe. From the beginning, her position was dominated by Archduchess Sophie, who exercised strict control over court life and imperial household structure. Elisabeth was immediately placed under rigid ceremonial expectations and strict behavioral rules. Shortly after the marriage, Elisabeth became pregnant. In 1855, she gave birth to her first daughter, Sophie. The child was taken from her care by Archduchess Sophie, who assumed full control over the child's upbringing. Elisabeth was not allowed to raise her own child and had little influence over her daily life. In 1856, a second daughter, Gisela, was born. The same pattern repeated. Both children were raised under the supervision of the Archduchess, not their mother. Elisabeth's role as a mother was structurally removed from her by court authority. At the same time, pressure increased for her to produce a male heir. In the Habsburg system, a queen who failed to produce a son was politically vulnerable and symbolically devalued. Court culture reinforced this pressure through internal expectations and social messaging. In 1857, Elisabeth traveled to Hungary with her children. During the return journey, both daughters became ill. Gisela recovered, but Sophie died in Budapest at the age of 2. Elisabeth was blamed by Archduchess Sophie for the child's death. This event marked the beginning of a long period of depression and psychological collapse. Elisabeth withdrew from court life, developed chronic illness symptoms, and suffered long-term emotional instability. In 1858, she gave birth to a son, Crown Prince Rudolph, securing the dynastic succession. Her political position improved, but her personal condition did not. She remained isolated, controlled, and psychologically detached from court life. Elisabeth developed a strong emotional attachment to Hungary, its people, and its culture. She learned the Hungarian language and formed close relationships with Hungarian political figures, including Gyula Andrássy. She supported political reconciliation between Austria and Hungary. Her influence contributed to the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, which created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary and restored constitutional status to Hungary. In 1867, Elisabeth and Franz Joseph were crowned Queen and King of Hungary in Budapest. That same year, Elisabeth gave birth to her fourth child, Marie Valerie, in Hungary. This was the only child she was allowed to raise personally, without interference from Archduchess Sophie. Elisabeth developed a deep emotional attachment to Marie Valerie, while her relationships with her older children remained distant and complex. Throughout her adult life, Elisabeth avoided court duties, ceremonial obligations, and imperial representation. She traveled constantly across Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. She spent long periods in Greece, Switzerland, Italy, and on Mediterranean islands. She rejected permanent residence, avoided public appearances, and increasingly withdrew from political life. Elisabeth developed severe eating disorders, obsessive physical training routines, and extreme body control behaviors. Her appearance became a central focus of her identity, not as vanity alone, but as psychological control in a life where she had little authority over political or personal decisions. She also developed deep depressive episodes, emotional withdrawal, and long-term social isolation. In 1889, her son Crown Prince Rudolf died in the Meierling incident, a murder-suicide involving his lover, Mary Vetsera. The event destroyed Elisabeth emotionally. She entered permanent mourning, dressed in black for the rest of her life, and withdrew almost completely from public life. After Rudolf's death, Elisabeth lived almost entirely in exile from court society, traveling continuously under aliases, avoiding attention, and isolating herself from political and family structures. In 1898, while traveling in Geneva, Switzerland, Elisabeth was assassinated by Italian anarchist Luigi Lucchini, who targeted her as a symbolic imperial figure. He stabbed her with a sharpened file. She died shortly afterward from internal injuries. She was 60 years old. Elisabeth's life has often been romanticized as tragic beauty, poetic suffering, and fairy tale tragedy. But historically, her story is not one of romance. It is the story of a young girl forced into an imperial system she was never prepared for, psychologically unsuited to, and structurally trapped within. She had no political authority, limited personal autonomy, and lived under constant institutional control. Her travel, isolation, and withdrawal were not expressions of luxury, but mechanisms of psychological survival. Her attachment to Hungary, her rejection of court life, her avoidance of Vienna, and her permanent movement across Europe were not acts of rebellion, but coping strategies. Elisabeth was not a ruler in practice. She did not govern policy. She did not control the empire. Her influence was symbolic and emotional rather than administrative. Her legacy is not one of political power, but of cultural memory. She became a symbol of beauty, freedom, and suffering, but historically, she represents something more complex. A woman trapped inside an imperial structure that offered status without autonomy, reverence without freedom, and admiration without protection. She was admired publicly and isolated privately. She was idealized culturally and controlled institutionally. Her image survived, but her voice did not. When we look at Elisabeth today, we are not seeing a myth or a romantic figure. We are seeing a human being shaped by dynastic politics, court hierarchy, psychological pressure, and structural confinement. Not a fairy tale empress, not a legend, not a symbol, but a real woman who lived inside one of the most rigid royal systems in Europe and spent most of her life trying to escape it. And now, for the first time in centuries, we do not look at her only through portraits, statues, or paintings. We look at her as a living presence, not reconstructed, not reimagined, not redesigned, but gently brought back into motion, not as an empress, not as a symbol, not as an icon, but as a woman. A human face, human eyes, human expression, human presence, not frozen in oil paint, not locked in marble, not trapped in historical myth, but alive again in the simplest sense of the word. Present, breathing, looking back. This is not the legend of Sisi. This is not the myth of Sisi. This is Elisabeth of Austria, a woman shaped by power, confined by empire, admired by millions, and understood by very few. Not history's fairy tale, but history's human being. Thank you for watching. If you value history told carefully and accurately, consider staying with this channel and subscribing. The past deserves precision as much as curiosity.